Was it worth prosecuting Julian Assange? Well over a decade of legal wrangling culminated in a plea bargain that set the WikiLeaks founder free. What will be the legacy of his prosecution for journalism, whistleblowing, and politics? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Julian Assange. Well, according to his guilty plea, Julian Assange conspired to obtain and disclose information related to US national defense. Information the US says put informants and others in danger. Still, though, Assange argued he believed his actions were protected by the First Amendment, and a number of legal experts believe that too. Now, after years of complicated geopolitical and judicial wranglings, Julian Assange is finally free on home soil in Australia. But his case leaves a complicated legacy for journalists, whistleblowers, and government transparency. Here's a look.
A 14-year-long legal nightmare comes to an end. Julian Assange finally steps foot on home soil in Australia after reaching a plea deal, accepting one US charge of espionage in return for the time served in a UK prison. The WikiLeaks founder received a hero's welcome in Canberra and was reunited with his wife and father. Stella Assange thanked the public's support and said her husband needs time to recuperate.
I ask you, please, to give us space, to give us privacy, to find our place, to let our family be a family before he can speak again at a time of his choosing.
In 2006, Assange founded WikiLeaks as a platform to publish confidential documents exposing government secrets and corruption. It caught global attention in 2010 with this video showing a US helicopter strike killing civilians and two Reuters journalists in Baghdad.
Come on, fire!
More and more shocking revelations about the US wars in Iraq and Afghanistan then followed. But just months later, Sweden issued an arrest warrant for Assange over allegations of rape and sexual assault. The UK Supreme Court ordered his extradition to Sweden in 2012. But then Assange took refuge in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, where he was given political asylum.
Good evening, London!
Sweden dropped the case in 2017, but it wasn't the end for Assange. In 2019, the Trump administration charged him for violating the Espionage Act. And after Ecuador revoked his asylum, British police removed Assange from the embassy and arrested him for skipping bail. The US extradition request kept him in Belmarsh prison for 5 years and 2 months. But the years of back and forth in the courtrooms ended this week. Assange won't face additional charges, but Washington reiterated that the US believes Assange's actions put people in danger.
I do think it is important when we talk about Julian Assange to remind the world that the actions for which he was indicted and for which he has now pled guilty are actions that put the lives of our partners, our allies, and our diplomats at risk, especially those who work in dangerous places like Afghanistan and Iraq.
Australia's Prime Minister Anthony Albanese talked to Assange on the phone and said the WikiLeaks founder thanked him for saving his life. While some rights groups celebrated Assange's release as a victory for press freedom and making journalists safer, others are not so optimistic. His lawyer, Jennifer Robinson, said the conviction sets a dangerous precedent.
This is the criminalisation of journalism. And while the plea deal does not set a judicial precedent, it's not a court decision, the prosecution itself sets a precedent that can be used against the rest of the media.
So, a journalist hero or a dangerous hacker? Assange has been a polarising figure for years, and while he's not spoken publicly yet, his wife says he plans to enjoy his freedom and continue to speak out against injustice.
Well, joining me now to discuss Julian Assange's release and the legacy of his legal battle is a close friend of the man himself, as well as a journalist and founder of London's Frontline Club, Vaughan Smith. Vaughan, thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.
For being with me. Yeah, great to have you, really. I need to start with a little bit of context because you had a very unique experience as a friend to Julian Assange. He actually sought refuge in your home for over a year when his legal troubles first started. And you said at that point, a lot of people started to abandon him, but you didn't. And that was actually in spite of, I must mention, losing thousands of dollars in bail money that you posted to secure his release. So why did you stand by him all these years, and what drove others away?
I was a friend of his. I also noticed as a journalist an extraordinary amount of disinformation, which I felt was governmentally inspired by possibly my government and almost certainly the American government, that I think was a distraction. And I felt that as I saw other people leave, I thought it was important that there were people that would stand up for him, and there weren't so many then. So I did so.
Why do you think those others didn't stand up for him? Was it just too much of a liability, or had he maybe let down some people?
I think some people may have thought they'd been let down. I didn't feel that. But I think that it got very uncomfortable. I would find people often quite rude to me. A lot of other journalists were rude to me because his relationship with many of the journalists he had worked with fell apart. And so I think there was also actually a deliberate attempt by the Americans and the authorities to separate him from his support.
So tell me then, what do you make of the former WikiLeaks colleagues, including a former spokesperson, who say, you know, your friend deliberately leaked names that actually should have been redacted, including those of Afghan informants that needed protection? Those names were actually redacted by various newspapers that used WikiLeaks, but reportedly, you know, the attitude of Assange was, oh, let the chips fall where they may. People said that was very dismissive, and that it showed he was more in it for himself rather than for the cause of journalistic integrity.
That is an accusation leveled at him, and you still see it today. It is untrue, though. It is, of course, more complex. In actual fact, what happened, he had a digital Dropbox, and journalists, for some reason, published the code to get into it. It sounds extraordinary, but that's actually what happened. So consequently, he only released information to actually protect other people because various governmental agencies did have the information, because actually it was leaked first by others who raided his box. The reality about Assange is he worked with some extremely established and highly regarded newspapers across the world, and he used the procedures that other journalists adopted, and was completely compliant with journalistic practice. So it's a misinformation to attribute that behavior to him, and it misunderstands what really happened.
Okay, so I mean, people argue he could have done better, he could have been less provocative. But you think he was more a victim of circumstance in this case?
I think he was a victim of circumstance, and he took decisions based on what he thought was the right thing to do at every stage. Okay. He's promoted as somebody irresponsible, but there are two views of Assange: heroic crusader of the truth, or hacker who engaged in lies. Well, as somebody who's a journalist and a critical journalist and an independent journalist who's looked at this and understands what actually happened, I'm more with the crusader for truth. And I feel it's rather unfortunate that quite so much misinformation is being put out about the Swedish allegations, about his responsibility as a journalist. And I feel it's highly irresponsible, but it has really covered people's view today.
So what happens now? You know, he's free. But no journalist or whistleblower or diplomat actually will ever forget what he's gone through. So does that mean they may not do their jobs in the same way and potentially as effectively?
Oh, I think that's I love that question, because I think it's something that should really focus our minds as journalists. My view is that this is a victory for journalism. And to understand the legal aspects, I'm not a lawyer, but it really hinges on the fact that as an Australian, not an American, he wasn't going to, had he been sent to America, but be protected by the US Constitution. And so those protections weren't going to be available for him. And that's ultimately what allowed him to come to a compromise. But it is so obviously a back down from the US government, that I do perceive it as a victory. I hope the US government will give him a pardon, and in that way, I think it resolves it. But I think I run a club for journalists in London called the Frontline Club, and I see journalist view all the time. It has been years since I've heard a journalist actually condemn Julian, and I'm a bit disappointed to see all the sort of sour grapes you see online about, often personal. I remember the New York Times putting a picture in their newspaper of Julian dressed as a bag lady, as a tramp, and it became so personal. I just think that's a lowest form of journalism, is to personally attack somebody like that, rather than look at the principles behind it.
Okay. Vaughan, quickly, you mentioned that you feel that this represents the back down of the U.S. government, but does the timing of his plea bargain, do you think, have anything to do with the possibility that Donald Trump, could be reelected for office again?
I don't see that. I feel that they backed down legally because they were going to lose a case in Britain, which would have probably freed him, and that would have been embarrassing. It would have revealed the fact that he's a journalist, not a hacker. So I struggle to see how it would have impacted the election. And bear in mind, should Trump win, Trump having promoted WikiLeaks, the organization Julian started, as the best thing since sliced bread before the 2016 election, then turned on him completely. And it was the Trump administration that initiated this. And so, I can't see the connection to the election, but it could be there, but I haven't seen it.
Okay, Vaughan, it's been great to speak to you, but stay with me because we can actually broaden out the discussion now and welcome two new panelists. And joining me from Boston is former CIA and National Intelligence Officer for Transnational Threats, Mr. Glenn Carle, and from Lancaster, UK, Senior Lecturer in Criminology at the University of Sussex, Mr. Luca Follis. Thanks so much, everyone, for being with me now. Glenn, I'm going to start with you because unlike Vaughan Smith, you feel Julian Assange should have been prosecuted for what he did and what transpired. Explain why.
I do. Well, my perspective is everyone will be able to understand or infer from the title that I had, the career that I had, is from an intelligence perspective. The legal issues I can't speak to as a professional, but whatever Julian Assange and WikiLeaks were at the beginning of WikiLeaks' existence, they pretty quickly morphed into or were co-opted by, certainly exploited by, Russian intelligence. And there's really that's certain. And he wasn't at that point acting as an independent journalist or a whistleblower, or he was acting as a conduit for Russian disinformation and manipulation of the American political process and society. And so understandably, as an intelligence officer, that is quite alarming and needs to be stopped. So from that perspective, I don't think anyone should be a supporter of Julian Assange, whether one's American or not. Disinformation and manipulation of public perceptions is a bad thing. And for anyone, and I'll include whistleblowers, it is a delicate issue that they must deal with, which is when is one morally and legally bound to get the truth out about facts that the public needs to know, and when does one have a responsibility to defer to a judicial system, a legal system, a political process, rather than taking it on themselves to be a judge, jury, and arbiter.
Okay, then I have to get back to Vaughan then regarding especially the first part of your answer there. And Vaughan, I mean, he's saying it started out well, it started out with some integrity, but then turned into more of a tool used by Russian intelligence. And there are accusations that Assange used WikiLeaks, to, in a way, exact his own revenge, particularly in a way that actually helped bring Donald Trump to power in order to harm Hillary Clinton. So what do you make of those accusations? Are they fair?
No, well, I don't think they're fair, but part of the problem, I'm not unsympathetic to the sentiment behind them. I mean, I don't think any citizen doesn't want to be protected by the state. The problem is there's never any evidence that that happened, and it can be seen and perceived as a wild accusation. And the implications for journalism are huge. And the manner in which the United States has followed this up, I think, has been disingenuous. So at first we were told that all sorts of people had suffered, and then we're told twice now by a court that there have been no real victims, and that it was irresponsible of him and he put us in danger. So I'm not trying to be unsympathetic to the sentiments. I just wish that the Americans would have played a straighter game on this. I wish they would have done more to encourage a debate with citizens about what should and shouldn't be in the public domain, and not make allegations which they're not prepared to back up with some sort of evidence. I think those are my reservations.
Okay, let me get to Luca, because, yeah, I mean, something disturbing about this case is that of the international jurisdiction and whether the U.S. should have the right to apply 100-year-old laws to foreign nationals who've never lived in the country, hardly even visited for that matter, and chase them down for decades, really, with the help, some call it collusion, of other governments.
Well, I mean, I think these are reciprocal arrangements between, two countries. The United States, sort of has the agreement in place with the UK, and so it can request that someone, a suspect, come and be extradited back, and that then sets up a situation where the UK can also request the same. The question of whether extradition as a process is something that is fair, I think is sort of besides the point. I mean, you would expect that the United States would seek out someone that essentially, released hundreds of thousands of classified documents, which, did or could have put personnel at risk. So yeah, it's not surprising that the United States would try to, like any other government really, try to come after him.
Okay. Listen, I want all three of you actually to hear, because we're really looking at the long-term consequences for journalists, whistleblowers, diplomats, and I want you to hear the words of one investigative journalist that I spoke to in an earlier debate, what he had to say about why WikiLeaks as an organization is truly so valuable to the wider public interest. So here is Anthony Lowenstein from just a few months ago. Take a listen.
As a journalist who's been working on a range of issues, from the drug war to Palestine to Afghanistan to a range of other issues in the last 20 years, there's really no news organization, and WikiLeaks is a news organization, that has published more vital documents on the state of the world in the 20th and 21st century. So a few examples briefly. Lots of work in my recent book on the Palestine Laboratory, looking at Israel's relationship with dictatorships in the last decades. WikiLeaks State Department cables that came out just over 10 years ago gave details about that. There were huge numbers of releases with the Afghan and Iraq war logs released in 2010 and 11, detailing huge numbers of US war crimes in both those countries. Clearly in the public interest. There's just no question about that information we did not know before that.
So, Glenn, let me ask you if you're convinced, hearing that, as far as WikiLeaks' journalistic value is concerned.
Well, in a way, it sets up a straw man to praise the comments, because it's selective in discussing the history and the function of WikiLeaks specifically, but the issue of whistleblowers and freedom of the press more broadly. And I ardently am a proponent, defender of, part of my oath was to help try to protect, frankly, the First Amendment for the United States, which is that of freedom of speech and free press. But that's not really the whole story. What happened was a selective publication of documents directed by the area of my concern, directed by a foreign series of intelligence services and a hostile power, so that the perception of the information given to the public was not the whole glass, but just half of it, and the empty half. And that is not okay.
Okay, Vaughan, I mean, is it fair to say there was deliberate selectiveness in what WikiLeaks took? Go ahead.
No, I mean, I would disagree with that because the way that Julian Assange set up WikiLeaks was he provided an a safe electronic Dropbox, so a whistleblower could drop stuff in, and he invited them broadly to drop it in and said that he would publish it. And it's important to note that WikiLeaks has never, nobody's ever alleged that WikiLeaks has published something that's not true, and that is a virtue in journalism. And so I find it difficult, but essentially, I think it's also tested the British legal system, and it's tested this whole idea, this new idea of what should be in the public domain in the internet age. And what I credit Julian for was introducing a debate, and I'd like to see the US participate in that debate in a more public way. But in fact, I think what they did was they kind of weaponized British law in a way that hasn't done our country much of a service. I think to understand it, it all comes from this idea. I mean, US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo described WikiLeaks, the organization that Julian founded that did these things, as a non-state hostile intelligence service. And so while we can say yes, I mean, I think we should all value what the America delivers in terms of the way it protects its citizens and the First Amendment and things like that, but they don't apply to an Australian. He's an Australian, not an American. And the reason that in the end he didn't get sent to America was simply because he wasn't going to be protected by those protection.
Glenn, go ahead quickly before I get back to Luca. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Well, there are a number of points with which our colleague and I disagree, but the last one in particular, that a non-American would not be protected by the American judicial system is simply not true. I was involved for years in the hideous issue of enhanced interrogation and detainees. And the reason that Guantanamo was created and the black sites where these people who were tortured were sent was specifically to avoid coming on physically onto a territory under the jurisdiction of the United States, where the American flag flew, because if that happened, then the person had to and would be subject to and protected by the American judicial system. And the perpetrators of the enhanced interrogation didn't want that to happen. In Assange's case, he was not a torturer. He was charged with different crimes, happily much lesser ones. And had he gone to the United States, it was his decision to put himself into detention, frankly, for years. He would have then been protected by the American judicial system. So it wasn't out to get him. And there aren't two levels of justice for Americans and for non-Americans. That simply is not true.
Okay, let me. Okay, very quickly, Vaughan, go ahead. And I need to get Lucas.
Well, that is the basis. That is, I would understand. I'm not a legal expert, and perhaps I'm not the best person to comment on this, but it is the basis which he is now in Australia, was that the British authorities didn't think he was going to get those protections. And what I would really ask is, while Julian Assange has promoted the truth and nobody's challenged that, I would suggest, not that everybody involved doesn't think they're doing the right thing. I'm not suggesting there's necessarily bad will. It's a different interpretation of things. But I present that the Americans have not presented the truth, that they've disassembled about what's really been happening. And I think that's unfortunate.
Okay. Luca, let me ask you then, now that this is, well, kind of said and done, I guess Julian Assange is a free man, what kind of legal precedents does all of this process set going forward? Does it help give any clarity to who is protected under what laws, who can be prosecuted by what laws, whether no matter when or where they were established, and in what country?
I mean, I think it's pretty straightforward. So first of all, obviously, the U.S. doesn't have like a two-tier system. So, you know, a defendant in criminal court in the United States enjoys all the protections of the U.S. courts. And Julian Assange would also enjoy those protections. In terms of extradition, I don't think it necessarily sets a precedent, but it is the case that, you know, particularly, you know, in these high-profile extradition cases, like the one that, the last one that went to the High Court in the UK and was also an extradition case for computer hacking. I'm thinking of Laurie Love in 2018. It was the case that the High Court blocked his extradition precisely because they were unsure that the U.S. would be able to house him in a jail that wouldn't necessarily have security failings and where he might sort of harm himself. So really there the High Court expressed its skepticism about the U.S. Criminal justice system and its ability to protect love, and I think probably something of the same sentiment was there in the Assange.
Very quickly then, aside from the legal precedents, do you think personally this has a chilling effect now? I asked Vaughan the similar question earlier. A chilling effect on whistleblowers, politicians, diplomats, and journalists going forward?
I mean, it can't but have a chilling effect. I mean, after all, he spent 5 years in a high security prison and never really saw the inside of a courtroom. Extradition hearings are not really the same as criminal proceedings. He wasn't able to see the evidence or contest the evidence against him. So in that sense, the fact that he was essentially held at the pleasure of the United States can't but have a chilling effect.
Luca Follis, that will have to be the final word, unfortunately, for this edition of The Newsmakers. We're completely out of time. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists sincerely so much for being with us. Our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on X, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.